In this video, we're going to be talking about the determination of price. Okay, so in other words, we're going to be putting what we learned about demand and about supply in the two previous videos together. Okay, and we're going to construct what we're going to call a market and examine how that market determines prices and quantities. Right, so I would encourage you to go and watch those previous videos first, okay? You have to understand about demand and supply to have any idea what I'm talking about in this video, okay? So get a good understanding of those and then move on to this one. All right, as usual, if you have any suggestions for further videos or any questions, just leave a comment down below and like and subscribe to my channel if you find these videos useful. Rather, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Okay, so let's start by defining what we mean by market. I've been using this term a lot, and I gave an informal definition of it in a previous video. I said that a market exists anytime there are producers and buyers who are interacting. In other words, every time a buyer says, hey, I'm selling some stuff, and some consumers come in and say, okay, I want to buy some of that stuff, well, that's a market. Yeah, and that's not wrong, but it's not formal either. So let me give you a formal textbook definition. By the way, as I say in the video descriptions, I'm more or less following Ragan's Microeconomics textbook, the 16th Canadian edition. So the formal definitions that I'm giving are, of course, not mine. They're his. Yeah, okay, so market. What is a market? A market is any situation in which buyers and sellers can negotiate the exchange of goods or services. Okay, so there are a few important features of this definition. Of course, you have both buyers and sellers, right? They are exchanging goods and services, but I would say one of the most important, or maybe the most important part of this definition is this word negotiate, okay? Now, negotiation in economics does not necessarily mean two people sitting down at a table and haggling, okay? As you would imagine in like an informal food market or something like that. But rather, negotiation simply means that both buyers and sellers have to agree in some sense on a price before the good can be exchanged. Now, we're going to see that that agreement is not necessarily explicit, but it is very much implicit in the effects of the collective action of all of the consumers and all of the sellers. Okay, and if that sounds weird, it's about to become a lot clearer. Okay, so let's start, okay, by putting our supply curve and demand curves on the same graph. Okay, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make both supply curves, both of the curves linear. Okay, straight lines. It's a simplifying assumption, okay, that they're linear. Okay, it makes it easier to do math with them. This is by no means to say that actual demand and supply curves in real life are linear, but I'm going to draw them that way. That's the kind of intro to econ way of drawing them, and like I said, it makes things easier. Okay, so we have our upward sloping supply curve, our downward sloping demand curve, and abracadabra, we have a market. Okay, Why do we have a market? Well, we have some good that's being exchanged, okay? We have our sellers, right? We have our consumers. And as we're about to see, this graph, at least according to standard economic theory, gives us exactly the information we need to be able to determine how much suppliers will end up charging for this good. All right, so let's start with 3 possible prices. All right. Now, because we're starting from a point of ignorance, we don't know how much the seller of this particular good is going to charge, and we want to see if we can make a kind of reasonable argument as to how much they're going to end up charging. So let's start with price P1. Okay, so, and I'm going to draw a line like this, and you'll see why in a second. Okay. P2 okay, and P3. Okay, let's start by examining P1. Okay, so if if the sellers in this particular market charged P1 for whatever good or service they're offering, what would the quantity demanded be? Well, the quantity demanded is simply this point here. Okay, well, these lines, all of these lines here, are perfectly horizontal. Okay, so the quantity demanded would be, let's call it Q1. Actually, we could just call it quantity demanded. What would the quantity supplied be? The quantity supplied would be this quantity here, QS. Okay, what do we notice? Well, we notice that QS is larger than QD. Okay? Quantity supplied is bigger than quantity demanded. So what would you have in this market? Well, you would have a bunch of suppliers making a lot more of whatever product we're talking about than consumers are willing to buy. So what would the end result be? Well, the end result is that the consumers would go out, they would buy what they want, and then the suppliers would have a whole bunch left over. Okay? They would have a whole bunch left over. This is called a surplus, okay? Or it's excess supply, okay? You could use either of those two terms. So in this case here with P1, we've got a surplus. Okay, now what are the firms going to do with all of that extra inventory? What are they going to do with their surplus? Well, they don't want to just keep it, right? They've already spent the money on producing it. They might as well try to sell it. Well, how are they going to sell it? Well, they might say, okay, clearly we're not able to sell it at this price. Maybe we'll try lowering our prices. Okay, we'll try lowering our prices until the consumers who didn't want the products at the previous price suddenly say, okay, you know what? That's a good enough deal. I'm going to buy it. So in other words, a surplus puts downward pressure on prices. Okay? When the economy has produced too much of something, then firms will try to cut their prices so as to sell whatever is left over. Okay? And of course, by the same token, okay, the consumers are also exerting their power over the market by essentially refusing to buy the products at those higher prices. This is where the term negotiate really comes from. Okay, by you can imagine a hypothetical conversation between one representative consumer and one representative firm. The representative consumer says, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to buy at that high of a price. And the firm says, well, okay, how about at this price? Will you buy at this price? And the consumer might say, okay, sure. And after that round of haggling, maybe there's still some more surplus. In that case, they'll come back to the table, and the firm will say, okay, I'll tell you what, I'll lower it even more. Okay, you get the picture here. The picture is of consumers who are not willing to buy at price P1, and so suppliers say, okay, I will lower my prices. Okay, now let's look at price P3. So at price P3, you essentially have the exact opposite situation, okay? What is the quantity demanded at P3? Well, the quantity demanded, again, just the intersection of the price line and the demand curve. Okay, so this would be quantity demanded, okay, for P3. Let's put that in the same color. Okay. And of course, quantity supplied will be at this point here. Over here, we have the opposite situation. We have quantity demanded exceeding quantity supplied. Okay, so consumers want to buy more than producers are willing to sell to them. Okay, so this is what's referred to as a shortage. Now, shortage is just the opposite of surplus. It's excess demand. Okay, quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied. What would happen in this case? Well, suppliers are smart. They realize that, okay, wow, our product is in very, very high demand. What if we push up our prices a bit? What would happen then? Well, surely some consumers would not be willing to buy at that higher price. But because there's such a high level of quantity demanded, chances are that suppliers will be able to charge a higher price. Just think about markets for very, very rare items. Okay, I don't know if any of you know anything about collectibles like baseball cards, hockey cards, Pokemon cards, rare comic books, things like that. Paintings are another example. They're the rarest kind of item because there's really only one of each original painting. What happens? Well, consumers bid up the price, right? Whoever owns the rare Pokemon card or the rare painting or whatever any other rare item that's in high demand says, I have a hot commodity on my hands. I can probably charge a lot of money for this. So they start pushing up the price. So this is all another way of saying that a shortage causes upward pressure on prices, right? Okay, now let's take the situation of P2. At P2, okay, quantity supplied. At P2, quantity supplied is this point here. And you'll notice that quantity demanded is the exact same thing, okay? This point of intersection between the demand curves and the supply curves the point of intersection of the two basically represents the quantity and the price at which quantity supplied is exactly equal to quantity demanded, right? So for consistency here, let's put P2 in blue. Okay, so here you've got quantity demanded, which is equal to quantity supplied. Okay, what would happen in such a market? Well, I'm going to argue that exactly nothing would happen, okay? Suppliers do not have any incentive to increase their supply, right? Why would they do that? If they increased their supply, right, they wouldn't be able to sell it, right? Because this number here, whatever it is the amount that consumers want. Any excess supply simply won't be sold at that price, okay? They would be forced to lower their price. But of course, if they lower their price, then you'd be in some situation down here, right? And you'd have a shortage once again, which would once again put upward pressure on prices. Similarly, at this point, okay, firms have no incentive to increase their prices or to decrease quantity supplied, right? So let's say they increase their prices. Well, then you'd be in a situation of a surplus, and that would once again put downward pressure on prices. So the firms are essentially stuck at that price, right? Similarly, consumers will not want to bid the price up or down because they're perfectly satisfied, right? At that price, they're getting exactly the amount that they want. This is what is referred to as equilibrium, okay? At equilibrium, so when quantity supplied and quantity demanded are equal, there is no incentive for suppliers to increase their price or decrease their price. There's no incentive to change the quantity, right? And there's no incentive for consumers to bid the price up or down. Everyone's kind of happy at that price, okay? So, what do you think will be the market price? The market price will simply be the equilibrium price, P2. P2 is the equilibrium price, okay? So, let's make that nice and neat on a fresh graph. Oops. So, classic economic theory tells us that the point of intersection between the supply curve and the demand curve determines the market price. So let's call this point E. That's our equilibrium point. And point E gives us our equilibrium price or market price, PE, and our equilibrium quantity. Okay? So in a market that's in equilibrium, PE will be our price, QE will be the quantity exchanged. Okay? Okay, right, and this equilibrium point is always determined, of course, by the intersection of the supply and demand curve. Oh, I think I already said that. Okay, before we end the video, let's just give a kind of numerical example of how to find our equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. Using some equations, and then I'll say a little bit about the difference between relative prices and absolute prices. It's more of a side note for the purposes of introductory economics, or at least the beginning part of these courses, but it'll become relevant later. Okay, so let's use a numerical example here. So let's say you're given a problem in which you're told that QD, so quantity demanded, is equal to 100 minus 3P, and quantity supplied is equal to 20 plus 2P, okay? P being price, of course. Okay, first of all, let's check if these equations make sense, okay? So, of course, on this graph, the y-axis has P on it, right? And the x-axis has Q on it. So let's put these equations in the form of P is equal to something, okay? Just to check that these equations make sense. So let's start with this one over here, okay? So if we bring the 100 over to the other side, we get negative 3P is equal to QD minus 100, right? And then if we divide both sides by negative 3, we get that P is equal to QD minus 100 over negative 3, which can also be written as price is equal to negative 1 over 3 QD plus 100 over 3. Now, does that make sense? Well, what do we mean by make sense? Well, we want the slope to be negative, right, which we have here. Negative 1 over 3 is negative, so that's good because we want our demand curve to be downward sloping. and we have some positive number for the y-intercept. Okay, so if this were this demand curve, our y-intercept would be somewhere up here. We would want it to be positive, which is correct, and we would want it to be downward sloping. So this equation makes perfect sense. Okay, very quickly, let's just do the same thing for our supply curve. Okay, so doing some quick algebra, we get that 2p is equal to QS minus 20. Okay, and then if we divide both sides by 2, we get that P is equal to QS minus 20 over 2, which is equal to 1/2 QS minus 10. Okay, so in this case, does this make sense? Well, we want the slope to be positive, right? Because the supply curve is always upward sloping, so the slope should be positive, which we have. 1 over 2 is positive. And then we have a negative y-intercept. Does that make sense? Yeah, sure. The supply curve can be shaped such that it only intersects the y-axis somewhere below 0 here. Okay, so yeah, so that makes perfect sense for our supply curve. Okay, so let's find the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity based on these two equations. How do we do that? Well, the first thing we should do is to notice that at equilibrium, quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied, right? At equilibrium. Okay, so maybe we can just rewrite these equations and make QD and QS just equal to Q, okay? Since they're going to be the same anyway. So we have that Q is equal to 100 minus 3P, and Q is equal to 20 plus 2P. Well, now, if you remember your high school algebra, we've got two unknowns, Q and P, right? And two equations. Perfect. We can solve this system of equations, okay? So if Q is equal to 100 minus 3P, and it's also equal to 20 plus 2P, we can write that 100 minus 3P, which comes from this, is equal to 20 plus 2P, which comes from that, right? And now we just solve for P. So solving for P, we get that 100 minus 20 is equal to 2P plus 3P, which means that 80 is equal to 5P. Dividing both sides by 5, we get that P is equal to 20. So our equilibrium price is equal to 20. Oh my, I've made a terrible mistake. 80 divided by 5 is 16, not 20. Okay, 16. Okay, so our price is equal to, our equilibrium price is equal to 16. Okay, how do we find our equilibrium quantity now? Well, since these two equations are equal, all we have to do is insert 16 into one of them. So let's insert 16 into this equation. So we get that Q, we could, in economics notation, we often put a star next to things that are the equilibrium. So we could say that P star is equal to 16 because it's our equilibrium price. So Q star will be equal to 20 plus 2 times our equilibrium price, which is 16. This equals 20 plus 32, which equals 52. Okay, so our equilibrium quantity is 52. Now, we could also check our work, right? We could insert 16 into the other equation and check that we also get 52. Okay, if we don't get 52, it means we've made some kind of mistake, right? Because the two equations are supposed to be equal. So let's test it with the other equation to check our work. Q is equal to 100 minus 3 times 16, which is equal to 100 minus 48, which is indeed equal to 52. So good, we're done. Okay, final note, okay, we're going to be let's talk a little bit about the difference between relative prices and absolute prices, okay? So an absolute price is just equal to the dollar amount. So this is actually what you have to pay to buy that unit, okay? So the absolute price of an apple is just the price that you pay for one apple when you go to the store, whereas the relative price, okay, the relative price is the ratio of two prices, okay? So if you take the absolute price of apples and then you divide it by the absolute price of oranges, you get the relative price of apples and oranges, okay? Why is this important? Well, we've been using the term ceteris paribus a lot. We said that, for example, okay, when you have when you have a demand curve, right, we said that if the price of the good goes from P1 down to P2, you'll get an increase in quantity, right, from Q1 to Q2. Now, the ceteris paribus insertion here is really important, okay? Because what you're essentially saying here is that this good has gotten cheaper, so therefore consumers want more of it, okay? But what you really mean by cheaper, or at least what we mean in economics, is cheaper relative to other goods. That's why ceteris paribus is so important. When we say that the price has decreased, ceteris paribus, included in that ceteris paribus is, of course, the price of other goods, right? So let's say this were the market for apples, okay? So what we mean to say when we say that if the price of apples goes from P1 to P2, then the quantity of apples increases from the quantity demanded of apples increases from Q1 to Q2, what we're saying is holding the prices of all other things equal, okay? Including the price of oranges. Okay, but what if we get rid of that assumption? What if we say, okay, now we're going to let the price of oranges vary, okay? And furthermore, we're going to say that apples and oranges are substitutes, okay? So let's write that down. Apples and oranges are substitutes in consumption, okay? And we let the price of apples and oranges vary together. Well, then, okay, even if the absolute price of apples decreases, if the absolute prices of oranges decreases by more, then suddenly oranges are actually relatively cheaper than apples, and apples have gotten relatively more expensive. So the relative price of apples would go up, and then you wouldn't see that increase in quantity demanded. Okay, so that's super important. It's just a kind of side note. This probably won't come up until much later in this course if you're taking an intro to micro course, but it is important to flag. Okay. All right, so that's it for this video. Like, subscribe, leave a comment down below if you have suggestions, and I will see you in the next video.